people talk about peace and serenity in my work and so forth. I paint what I like to see. Certain things I always want in my paintings. I want them to have formal structure, but I'm also interested in their carrying some kind of emotional impact. And if they don't do that, the structure's no good. Artists live in a peculiar world where the art is the important thing, and a lot of the comforts and luxuries of life that mean so much to most people are not quite that important. I've never felt that the fact that I happened to be female worked against me. I mean, the work was the thing, if that was acceptable. And if I was thrown out of a show, I thought somebody didn't like my paint, you know. Well, Helen Lundeberg started in Chicago. Although I feel I'm almost a Californian because while I was born in Chicago, my parents had the good sense to move to California when I was only 4.5 years old. So I grew up, went to school here, worked here all my life. We had, my sister and I were kids, on a Sunday afternoon the whole family was reading. And sometimes you couldn't hear a pin drop. And of course the reading with me became a lifelong habit, and it's always meant a lot to me. I grew up in Pasadena, and I went to the Pasadena City Schools, and to the grammar schools, and to high school a little young because I skipped a grade, and they thought I wasn't getting enough work to do, so they made me take a summer course, which pushed me up a little. So I was just 13 when I went to high school. And in that first year of high school, examinations were given to students that were considered promising for that Lewis Terman Stanford program. I think something about gifted children. And out of that bunch of kids, I was one of those picked to be followed and investigated the rest of my life. But I think the best thing it did for me was probably that it made my parents think they maybe had something special and they should indulge my inclinations to do this or that. Maybe I was a little genius, you know. From high school, I went to the Pasadena Junior College. So while I was wondering what to do next, a woman in my father's office, a bookkeeper, offered me a 3-month course at the Little Stickney School of Art right there in Pasadena. So I had thought of wanting to go to art school, but it seemed out of the question. Well, I learned something in the first 2-3 months there, but not very much, just something about proportion and constructing a figure in life drawing. And the composition class on Saturday mornings was a puzzle to me because the teacher never made clear why this was good and why that was not good. I was always in a state of confusion. But then this teacher, fortunately, went off to Mexico for a summer vacation. And Lorcer Feitelson took over his classes. Well, that was it. I mean, I found out what it was all about. That was wonderful. That was the luckiest thing that ever happened to me. He not only taught me about the art of drawing the figure, but he made great diagrams on a board before the class, analyzing everything from the old masters to modern masters. Fate had grabbed me. I went to the school, I met Lorcer, that was it. Our first meeting was sort of funny. I was alone in the school studio, working up one of those little drawings for the composition class. Not knowing very much about what I was doing, but anyway, working away. And the school caretaker, Gabaza, brought this young man in, and he said, Mr. Feitelson is going to be our new teacher for the next sessions. And so, well, it was a very hot day. He sat down on a bench behind me somewhere and looked at what I was doing, and he couldn't resist coming up and telling me right away where I was going wrong. Well, at first I didn't realize that I was falling in love with my teacher. That was something one didn't do. So it took several months before I realized it. And it took a little bit longer for him to have the nerve to tell me how he felt. And that was it. That was something that went on all the rest of our lives. It's one of the wonderful things about Lorcer as a teacher was that he encouraged me to begin to think of myself as an artist, not just as a, student. I later knew students who were students all their lives. They went from one artist studio to another to study. But Lorcer encouraged me to enter my first oil painting at the end of my first year of study in a juried exhibition in San Diego, in the Fine Arts Gallery there. And that was my first little painting called Apple Harvest. And I did, and by golly, it got in. And that was the beginning of my career as an exhibiting artist. So after that, every year, I entered something in some competitive exhibition. And that same year, 1933, I had my first little one-man show at a little gallery in the Stanley Rose Bookshop on Vine Street in Hollywood. It was a tiny gallery. It was a mezzanine in a bookshop. And it was a very well-known bookshop, patronized by, people connected with the movies who also liked to go to the Al Levy restaurant next door. And this self-portrait was one of the things hung in that show. In 1933 was quite a year for me because that was the year, I think late in the year, when the first PWAP art project was started, and I remember standing in line with other painters with my painting in my hand to go up before a committee which examined the work, and the method was that we had to bring in an example of what we were doing and collect the paycheck. That was when I had to move away from the family home and move into Los Angeles, because I had to be within walking distance of that headquarters, which was at 7th and Hoover. So I moved into a rather crummy district I found an apartment. It was cheap. It was close enough. And it was only later that I found out that that whole district was known as a sort of a red light district. However, nobody bothered me, so it scared me a little. 1933 was also the year when Larcer and I began to really formulate the idea of a new classicism, which used elements used by the surrealists, the association of ideas connected with objects and so on. But we didn't like the automatism that was involved in surrealism. Larcer was a classicist, which meant that he believed in structure. He said, to record dreams or fantasies isn't necessarily art. You have to do something with it. You have to make a painting. Through the association of ideas with objects, one could construct a painting whose structure was really subjective. We started out by calling it new classicism or a subjective classicism, and tacked on somewhere the word post-surrealism, which was sort of sassy because the surrealists were riding high then. And that's the name that stuck. For that first little showing of post-surreal paintings, our earliest ones, at the little Centaur Gallery in Hollywood, Larcer and I concocted a sort of manifesto. It was just a little pamphlet with my plant and animal analogies reproduced on one page and the article on the other. We distinguished between the kinds of paintings that could be called subjective classicism or the new classicism. And one kind we called idea entity, the other mood entity. Now, my first mirror painting belongs to the mood entity category because it doesn't express an idea, it puts forth a mystery. Another painting, which I guess would fall into the idea entity category, is the double portrait of the artist in time. I was playing with infancy and adulthood, and the central figure in the foreground is a child about 2 years old, which I did from a baby portrait that had been made of me. I still have it. And by painting the infant as real and smiling and holding a little budding flower in her hand, and casting a shadow from her to the wall back of her and up the wall and overlapping a self-portrait I had done earlier, I was sort of playing with time in reverse, as it were, as if the infant shadow forecast the adult. That painting has been, the double portrait has been reproduced over and over again. It seems to catch people's fancy in some way, and people read things into it which I didn't think I'd put into it, and yet they're appropriate. And I like that. For a long time I've been calling it my Mona Lisa. It's been reproduced so much that if nobody knows what else I did, they know that one. The double portrait of the artist in time was included in the large post-surrealist show, which first went to the San Francisco Museum of Art, and it was invited to the Brooklyn Museum and kept there for 5 months. Our show at the Brooklyn Museum got a very nice notice from Edward Alden Jewell, who was the great Panjandrum art critic of the New York Times at that time. As a result of that Eastern show, 3 of us received invitations to the Museum of Modern Art's 1936 show, Fantastic Art, Dada, and Surrealism. One of the reasons that we were pleased to be included in that show was that at that time Los Angeles was really way on the fringe of civilization as far as New York art was concerned. And there were many artists who thought nothing of any importance happened but west of the Hudson. The painting Cosmocide puzzles people sometimes because of its strange shape. But Lorcer and I had been talking about the shapes of paintings and why they should always be rectangular. So I thought I'd try a blunted triangle because it suited my subject matter, Cosmocide, very well. This painting, Relative Magnitude, is, I consider my one humorous painting. I got a lot of fun out of the idea of the old astronomer sitting here staring through his telescope. And of course the comparison is to a little ant on the book page here and the enormity of the marble he's looking at, which looks like some tremendous planet rising over the hill line of the drapery. This painting, which is called Microcosm and Macrocosm, shows you the microcosm here is blown up by a microscope to show all these little creatures in it. And here's a further blow up, and here's an enlargement of one. And the little glass in the hand of the figure here is a sort of symbol for the microscope and the telescope. So here we come to some macrocosm, and here is the blow-up of one of these tiny things, which is Saturn. I don't know what else to say about it, except I'm sort of fond of this one. I've been asked what I thought about the federal art projects many times, and I must say that for me it was a wonderful thing. It enabled me to earn a living, to pursue my profession, and while what I did for the project was what the project wanted, I had time of my own in the evenings and weekends to, I continued to paint some post-surreal paintings. But I didn't do post-surrealism for the art project because it didn't work that way. Well, I did all sorts of things for them. I did first easel paintings and then some lithographs. I learned to do things I'd never dreamed of doing. I'd never dreamed of being given a big wall to paint on. And of course, the artist who was asked to design a mural was given the dimensions of the wall and the subject matter desired. Well, I did that kind of mural on the wall for Venice High School, partly there in collaboration with Grace Clements. Strange to see this mural after so many years. I don't think I've seen it since it was completed. It looks strange to me. It looks bigger than I expected it to for some reason or other. Also paler and more delicate in color. I'm also thinking about the wonderful scaffolding we had here. They'd built such beautiful ladders for us. I ran up and down all day, and the next day I could hardly wiggle. It was supposed to be a sort of history of the state of California, I guess, beginning with the Indians. These murals are done on acoustic plaster, which is the reason for their being done in this vignette style, which does not put a solid coat of oil paint and canvas on the wall, but simply uses the wall color as the light and the background for the whole thing. It's like a drawing with paint, with line and tone. I also did 3 panels that went around 3 walls of the city hall of Fullerton, and that meant that we had to go out. I and my crew met at the project headquarters, which was down on Western Avenue then, I think. And we had to drive all the way out to Fullerton every morning and back again. And that was the occasion of my having another new experience on the project. I drove a truck for about 5 days. A 5-ton truck was what they assigned us to go out to the job in. And it turned out that although there were 3 men in my crew, none of them had driver's licenses, and I did. So they said, okay, you drive the truck. I didn't have a truck driver's license, but anyway, I had a driver's license. And it was fun because I'd never driven a truck before. But then some busybody spied me driving that truck and said, what's a woman driving a truck? That was the end of my career as a truck driver. They got somebody to do it. Other murals that I designed for the Arts Project were done in a medium that was, I think, invented by the people at the project. It was the use of colored cement and aggregate or crushed stone, such as is used for terrazzo floors and so on. I was assigned to this mural project and given a subject by the head of the mural department, Mr. Feidelson. And I presume that he had talked with the Englewood people, and this is what they wanted, a history of transportation in this area. And it goes from the Indians down there to airplanes. They used a technique that's used for making terrazzo floors, but done in such a way that it could be laid down on masonite panels. 4 by 8, I think, was the standard size, and poured from the back. And then when the whole thing is solidified, it was polished. Now, it looked very nice. It looks faded to me now because it's had no polish in 40 years, I guess. Well, the Federal Art Project was really a wonderful thing for the artists of this country. During the Depression, they did worse than ever, and it wasn't that easy in good times. And during the worst times, well, they would have been starving or trying to find all sorts of odd jobs. The Art Project gave them a chance to work in their own profession. It really introduced the country to art and artists in a way that had never been done before. But when people ask me, well, would you like to see a Federal Art Project now? I say, no, I don't really believe in that kind of federal patronage in times which are not desperate, because there's always the conflicts of taste. There's art politics. There are some artists working today who are too avant-garde to be considered for grants or working for the government. The painting called The Evanescent is dated 1941-44. Now, I was working for the Arts Project during 41 and 42, but I was also painting for myself in my own time. I think you might call it the last real post-surrealist painting that I did. As the project was ending, I was beginning to get a little tired of something public and impersonal in the work I was doing, always with assistants to keep an eye on. It seems to me I spent more time watching what they were doing than doing it myself. When it came to working on a wall, I began to do some very small paintings of odd sizes on whatever turned up. This painting, which is called Dreaming, is one that I started even before the project was quite over. Well, then I painted a series of little paintings I called abandoned easels, of which this is an example. When the war was over, Lurch and I made a trip to New York in 1946. It was my very first trip to New York ever, and it was Lurch's first trip since he came out here in 1927. So it was a big thrill. We went back to see what New York looked like and to go to museums and galleries. And one thing we did was we seemed to be forever drinking something. I never drank so much in my life. I said afterward, we spent the time in a lovely alcoholic haze, but it was such fun. Lurch and I were invited to Peggy Guggenheim's house up in the 70s for after-dinner drinks, I guess, for a little night party. And it was interesting to see the Pollocks she had on the wall because they were pre-drip Pollocks. And quite late, we decided to walk back to our hotel, which was down on 40th Street. And we never thought of being afraid, and nobody accosted us or molested us, but you wouldn't dare to do it now. There have been many artists who went to New York because they thought their opportunities were better there. But Lurch and I, having visited New York and seen friends and looked around at what was going on and so forth and saw what the art world there was like, had no desire to move. We liked our relative isolation out here, being both sort of loners and out of sync with whatever was fashionable at the moment anyway. We were perfectly happy to stay right here. We were sort of a group of two and went our own way. And of course, if you're around long enough and exhibit enough, even New York knows that you exist. Well, A Quiet Place was a sort of accidental start of something different from what I had been doing. One afternoon I sat down with a canvas and I wanted to paint, but I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to put in it, so I began making an arrangement of rectangular areas that would suggest spaces, and not being sure what objects I was going to place in it. I got to a point where the thing seemed finished and I couldn't put any objects in it. I didn't quite know what to do about it, so I put it aside. But it really was maybe the beginning of a whole series of paintings in which all the interesting objects and symbolic things had dropped out. When I did begin to paint really hard-edge things, but not objective things. They always were planned to suggest landscape, interiors, exteriors of buildings, and so forth, cast shadows and lights on surfaces. They always had a relation to reality. I think they were inspired very much by some of Lorcer's hard-edge paintings, in which I saw a different kind of dimensions than he was aiming at. However, it took several years before I arrived at the point where I really began to work entirely with geometric shapes and dropped out all the interesting objects from my painting. The Wind That Blew the Sky Away was inspired by a walk down the street on a day when there were wonderful cloud formations and the sun coming through. And I had the thought, if one could see that whole cloudy atmosphere blown aside to show what's behind it. In 1952, Lorcer and I had to find a new working place and living place. And we had been living in a house where the studio space wasn't adequate except for rather small things. And so we began looking at commercial properties, at storefronts, in other words. This studio I'm sitting in now is made up of, it's what you call a live-in studio. It's made up of 2 stores. We didn't really intend to stay here. We kept looking for other places, but never found anything that quite suited us, and so here I still am. And I feel very comfortable and at home here. It was our home for a long time. Artists live in a peculiar world where the art is the important thing, and a lot of the comforts and luxuries of life that mean so much to most people are not quite that important. Of course, artists like to be comfortable. They like to eat and have a clean place, a comfortable place to live in and work in, and so on. But the things which people in society generally think of as symbols of success and prestige, like beautiful houses and furniture and cars and so forth and so on, don't mean that much. I haven't any objection to those things, but I haven't any ambition to acquire them. I mean, they can be just that sort of thing can be a nuisance, you know. The enigma of reality is one of my most painterly paintings, and it's painted in such a way that you can decide for yourself whether the painting on the left is the painting and the rest is its environment, or the painting on the right is the painting and the other side is its environment. That's all it means. Well, Selma was derived from a photograph I'd had enlarged with my mother when she was about 20. And I always liked it so much that I thought I would do a painting. And it's a sort of tribute to my mother. The hand holding the flowers is holding them up to her. And then, of course, there's a little sadder note with the flowers wilting on the windowsill and the view out into the dark. Because by that time I painted Selma, she was gone. The road was the first deliberate attempt to to do a painting in which all the objects had been dropped out, and it was composed of geometric areas which suggest an interior with divisions, a room and a room, and an opening to the out of doors, and a road which is also painted as a little geometric shape. It was the first of a whole series of paintings in which I used only flat, unmodulated, rectangular or angular areas to suggest landscape or interiors, exteriors, shadows and lights, what have you. Well, sometime in 1962, I got a little tired of working only with angular and rectangular shapes and wanted to introduce some curves. And I did a series of paintings that I called arches, number 1, 2, 3, and so forth, in which arches, mostly incomplete, mostly looking like pillars which are going to curve into an arch. But the combination of the arch going this way and another this way, and a straight side of a building and strange shaped shadows was very attractive, I thought. And so that accounts for that series. In 1965, I began to do a series of paintings which I called planets, and they were square canvases, usually black base with a round shape, with arbitrarily using shapes and colors within the circle. And I call these things planets. In 1968, I started a series of paintings that were based on the female torso, cut off at the shoulders and above the knee. And in its first state, looked rather like a beginning landscape. I don't know how much I'd done on it. I'd been working on it one day when Lorsa was teaching, and he came home from school, and he came in and he looked at it and he said, "Helen, do you know what you've done there?" And I smugly say, "Yes, of course, I'm doing a torso." I like to paint landscape, but I never paint landscape from landscapes. My one experiment with that when I was a student was a disaster. Everything fell over, the wind blew everything over. I didn't like it, so I didn't do it anymore. I made drawings out of doors at that time. But I've always been a looker from the time when my sister and I sat in the back seat of the family car and hung out the windows. So I have a whole repertory of images of landscape stored away. But basically, my landscapes are invented with that as my basic material. I don't know what inspired Icarus Bay, but I liked I liked the wing shape of the main area, and it was Lurcer who suggested the title for it. He said, "Why don't you call it Icarus Bay?" Because I was thinking, "No, what should I call this one?" And so he's responsible for that. Just to make them identifiable, I like to name paintings when I can find any kind of a decent title for them, because I have struggled with trying to identify Lurcer's paintings, so many of which were just untitled and could only be identified by a description of the forms and color and the date. And besides, I like names when I can find good ones. Aegean Light got its name in a funny way. We hung it up on the wall, and two different people came in who said, "Oh, that's like the light in the Aegean." And I thought, gee, what a lovely suggestion for a title. I got the idea for the basic forms in Cobalt Sky from a fragment of a reproduction in some old book we had on architecture. When you look at it, you don't know how high in the air you are or where you are, because there's nothing but sky and the pillars on the sides. I don't consider myself a prolific painter, although as I look back and I look at all the slides and the photographs and things, it looks as if I'd done a lot of work. But I don't paint that many paintings every year. I don't. Sometimes I take a long. Sometimes everything goes well, and I think it's a miracle. I don't have to make too many changes, but very often I work over and over and over a painting until I'm satisfied with it. So that doesn't make for a huge production. I'm always interested in the still life, not just as a depiction of things, of fruits and bowls and so forth, and plants and so forth, but as formal arrangements. I don't care for painting exotic things which are exotic or terribly interesting in themselves. I don't care for that kind of thing. I like to paint very simple things, like a bowl and some lemons or peaches and a paper bag that came in, or whatever things might be about, and quite commonplace. It's how they're painted and how they're arranged that makes them worth doing. Well, I had a funny remark made to me that not only that I'm a very private person, which I am, but that I've avoided fame, and I'm not conscious of having thought about that one way or the other. And I don't know, I'm famous with some people, but I'm not famous like Picasso, and it doesn't concern me especially. It's true that I was fortunate in getting paintings accepted almost immediately when I began to try to exhibit. But I just felt very lucky. I had encouragement at home, of course. Lurcer encouraged me from the very beginning. It was he that, I don't think I would have thought of sending that first little oil painting to a regional juried show if he hadn't said, "Go on, send it." So I thought, if he thinks it's good enough, I think it's good enough, and I'll send it, which I did. And it was accepted. But Lurcer was always like that. He always, and if there was a show, some kind of a show to which artists were being invited, and he was invited and I was not, he'd be angry about it. He would think it was all wrong. Whereas, I could accept it. You don't always get invited. But no, he was my grand support and encourager, always. Which I think is rather wonderful, because male artists don't always feel that way about their artist wives. they expect them to be a little humble. And I never had that experience. Larsa and I were together and worked in the same studio for many, many years. And these days that seems to be unusual. But, well, I don't know what to say about that. It was wonderful, and it seemed inevitable. It seemed that was how it was meant to be. Of course, we had our ups and downs and little bumps and disagreements, and yelled at each other occasionally and so forth, but it never broke the real tie. And that was too strong. When Larsa died, it was really very suddenly. And I didn't believe it was going to happen. I knew he was very ill. He went into the hospital. The next morning, he was gone. He always took for granted that he would go first. And I always pushed away the idea and hoped that maybe we'd be lucky enough to go together in a plane crash or a car crash or some catastrophe that would wipe us out together, because I thought that I would simply fall apart, you know, if he died first. But you might wish to do that, but I'm a responsible person, you see, and there were all sorts of things to do, arrangements to make. I had many letters from people that had to be at least acknowledged. There were all sorts of practical things to be discussed and taken care of. So I did all these things fairly respectably, I think in a state of shock, and got through somehow. And I carried on with my painting because I knew that was what Larsa would expect me and want me to do. And but I miss him still very much. People talk about peace and serenity in my work and so forth. I paint what I like to see. I don't like disorder and confusion or violence. And I know they go on in the world, but why should I have to paint them? If a painting doesn't add up to a mood or something. I'm not interested, you see, in doing a purely formal, abstract sort of thing. It has to say something to me, but not in so many words, because I can't put it in words. Certain themes keep repeating themselves in my work. Sometimes I see new possibilities in something I've done maybe long ago or maybe not too long ago, and I find another way to deal with that subject matter or that particular set of objects or whatever. When I have an idea for a painting, I make sketches. First, of course, I make some little pencil sketches, very rough, just to establish an idea. Then Then I make a color sketch to scale with the canvas I intend to use, to establish shapes and proportions and colors and so on. And of course the canvas often turns out a little different, and I still have to work on it. And the way I do it is to measure, for instance, this point from the corner, the width of this, and I use narrow tape to, and of course the bottom point's here. I use a narrow tape to define the areas. Then I'll use tape to define this horizon line and to define this line, and sometimes the larger shapes within a colored area. In the sketch, I just depicted this framework or window with pencil. And I was even tempted to do it with a line, but it didn't work. So I had to use a tone to suggest that this has thickness and that is a sill and the other side has thickness too. But they're pretty close. Well, I suppose the thread that ties any artist's work all together is the artist's peculiar sensibility. I mean, certain things I always want in my paintings. I'm interested in their formal structure, but I'm also interested in their carrying some kind of emotional impact. And if they don't do that, the structure's no good. I'm not interested in just nice arrangements of shapes and things. It has to be intertwined and inseparable. I feel now that I'm part of, even a small part of art history, and I know very well the story of artists who have been highly thought of at one time and forgotten at another time and picked up again. Think of El Greco. Not that I'm comparing myself with El Greco, but I know how serendipitous the whole thing is. So all I can do is hope for the best, you know. What do I want from life now at this late date? One thing I hope for is to remain compos mentis and able to live independently and pop off quickly someday. The other thing is that in the meantime, I hope to do some more decent paintings, maybe even think up new things to do. I just hope to go on working as long as I can wiggle a brush, you know.